ripping through the humid air over the Solomon Islands. A chest-crushing thump-thump-thump shattered the night. It wasn't the familiar chatter of machine guns or the shriek of a falling bomb. Panic gripped the Japanese soldiers in their armored barges as their steel hulls were inexplicably shredded by an unseen phantom they dubbed Akuma no Funi, the Devil Boat. Yet, this apocalyptic firepower didn't come from a heavily armed naval destroyer. It came from an 80-foot plywood dinghy. This is the unbelievable true story of desperate American sailors. A crashed P-39 Airacobra, rotting in a mosquito-infested jungle, and a lunatic gamble to bolt a massive aircraft cannon onto a fragile wooden boat. The heat in the South Pacific didn't just make you sweat. It felt like it was trying to drown you. It was August 1943, and the United States Navy's motor torpedo boat squadrons, the so-called Splinter Fleet, were bleeding out in the dark waters surrounding New Georgia. Lieutenant Arthur Higgins stood at the helm of PT-173, his knuckles white as he gripped the wheel. His uniform was soaked, plastered to his skin with a mixture of salt spray, engine oil, and fear. Higgins was 24, a former architecture student from Chicago, who now found himself commanding 78 feet of mahogany, spruce, and high-octane aviation fuel. To the public back home, the PT boats were glamorous, fast, and deadly. To the men who sailed them, they were floating matchboxes. "Come on, come on," Higgins muttered, squinting through the pitch-black night. To his right, gunner's mate second class Samuel Peterson was frantically trying to clear a jam in the twin, 50 caliber machine guns. "She's seized up, Skipper. The salt's got into the housing again." "Leave it, Sam. Just hold tight," Higgins yelled, over the deafening roar of the 3 Packard V-12 engines. They were running for their lives. Less than an hour ago, PT-173 had intercepted a section of the Tokyo Express, the relentless Japanese supply convoys that moved troops and equipment down the slot under the cover of darkness. But Higgins hadn't found cruisers or destroyers. He had found Daihatsu-class landing barges. These barges were the bane of the PT squadrons. They were heavily armored, shallow-draft vessels carrying troops, supplies, and rapid-fire cannons. The standard PT boat tactic was to swoop in and fire torpedoes, but the American Mark 8 torpedoes were notoriously defective. They either ran too deep, passing right under the shallow barges, or they slammed into the steel hulls with a dull thud, their detonators failing to ignite. Higgins had ordered a torpedo strike anyway. 2 heavy steel fish had leapt from the tubes of PT-173, churning a white wake toward the lead barge. Both had failed. One went deep. The other struck the barge's port side and bounced off like a massive, useless log. In response, the Japanese barges had opened up with their 20mm cannons. The glowing green tracer rounds had chewed through PT-173's wooden hull like a buzzsaw through paper. Higgins had instantly lost his radio operator to a piece of shrapnel and had his forward deck shredded, with torpedoes being useless, and their 50 caliber machine guns just pinging harmlessly off the thick armor plating of the Daihatsus. Higgins had no choice but to throw the throttles wide open and lay down a smokescreen to escape. Now, limping back to their makeshift base at Rendova, the mood aboard the boat was a toxic mix of adrenaline and crushing defeat. Below decks, in the stifling engine room, Corporal Thomas Gallagher wiped a streak of grease from his forehead. Gallagher wasn't Navy. He was a misplaced Army Air Forces mechanic who had been stranded at the naval base after a bout of malaria and somehow ended up turning wrenches for the PT boys. He was a quiet, intensely focused kid from Detroit who had grown up rebuilding Ford Model T engines. As the boat finally eased into the camouflaged cove at Rendova, as dawn broke, the damage was horrifying in the daylight. The hull was splintered, jagged holes punched through the deck where the Japanese 20mm rounds had struck. Base Commander Richard Sterling was waiting on the wooden dock, his hands on his hips, jaw set tight. He watched in grim silence as Higgins cut the engines. "Report, Lieutenant," Sterling said. His voice clipped. "Torpedoes failed, sir," Higgins said, stepping off the boat, his legs feeling like lead. "Both of them. And our 50s couldn't scratch their paint. We were outgunned by a damn freight barge." Sterling sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "That makes 3 boats this week, Artie. We can't keep sending you boys out there with spitballs. Washington says new torpedo detonators are coming. But, with all due respect, Commander, by the time Washington fixes the torpedoes, I won't have a crew left," Higgins interrupted, his voice shaking with suppressed rage. "We need something that can punch through steel. We need artillery." "On a wooden boat?" Sterling raised an eyebrow. "You put a field gun on that deck. The recoil will blow the bottom out of your own ship before the Japanese even get a chance to shoot at you." Gallagher, having climbed up from the engine room, stood quietly near the stern, listening. He looked at the shattered wood of the boat, then out toward the dense, emerald jungle of the surrounding islands. An idea, reckless and desperate, was already beginning to form in the Detroit mechanic's mind. 2 days later, the war offered them a brutal, tragic gift. A routine coastal patrol by a squad of Marines had stumbled upon the wreckage of an American fighter plane that had gone down a week prior during a dogfight over the nearby island of Colombangara. It was a Bell P-39 Airacobra. Gallagher was part of the salvage team, sent into the jungle to recover the pilot's remains and destroy any sensitive equipment before the Japanese could find it. The trek through the jungle was a nightmare of razor-sharp elephant grass, suffocating humidity, and the constant, buzzing menace of mosquitoes. When they finally breached a small clearing, the wreckage came into view. The P-39 had clipped the canopy of a massive banyan tree, tearing off its wings before slamming nose first into the soft, muddy earth. Gallagher approached the fuselage. He knew the P-39 well. It was a weird, unorthodox bird. Unlike most fighters that had the engine up front, the Airacobra's engine was placed behind the pilot. This design choice allowed for something unprecedented. The entire nose of the aircraft was free to house a massive weapon. Gallagher knelt beside the crumpled cockpit. The pilot, a lieutenant named David O'Connor, had not survived the impact. After the Marines respectfully removed O'Connor's remains, Gallagher moved to the mangled front of the aircraft. He brushed away the ferns and mud covering the nose. Protruding directly through the center of the propeller hub was the unmistakable, terrifying barrel of an Oldsmobile 37mm M4 cannon. It was an anti-tank gun strapped to an airplane. It fired high-explosive, armor-piercing shells, the size of milk bottles. Gallagher stared at the massive gun. He traced the metal of the barrel, then looked down at his grease-stained hands. He remembered Higgins's desperate plea on the dock. "We need something that can punch through steel." He ran back to the Marine sergeant in charge of the detail. "Sarge, I need your men to help me dig this nose section out." "Are you crazy, Gallagher? We're supposed to blow the wreck and move out. There's a Jap patrol reported 2 miles north of here." "I don't care," Gallagher said, a wild look in his eyes. "That gun. We need that gun. I'm taking it back to Rendova." It took 4 agonizing hours. They had to use machetes to hack away the twisted duralumin skin of the aircraft. Gallagher, using tools from his canvas satchel, meticulously disconnected the massive cannon from its mounts. It wasn't just the gun. It was the 30-round continuous loop ammunition magazine and the electronic firing solenoids. The whole assembly weighed over 300 pounds. They rigged a makeshift sled out of bamboo and dragged the heavy artillery piece through the jungle mud, slipping and cursing all the way back to the extraction point. When Gallagher finally hauled the mud-caked cannon onto the docks at Rendova, Higgins was waiting. "What in God's name is that, Tommy?" Higgins asked, staring at the mechanical monstrosity. "This, Skipper," Gallagher panted, wiping mud and sweat from his eyes, "is our new forward battery. It's a 3.7mm auto cannon. It can punch through 1.5 inches of armor plate at 500 yards. Higgins's eyes widened. He looked from the gun to the splintered, patched-up bow of PT-173. "You want to put an anti-tank gun on my boat?" "Yes, sir." "Gallagher, the deck is an inch of mahogany. The recoil of that thing will rip the bow right off the boat. Commander Sterling was right. We'll sink ourselves." Gallagher grinned, a tired, manic smile. "Not if we reinforce the deck. I found some half-inch steel plating in the scrapyard from a busted bulldozer. We bolt the steel to the deck. Tie it directly into the keel ribs with heavy lag bolts. We disperse the shock wave across the whole forward frame. We don't mount it on a pedestal. We keep it low. Bolt the actual nose frame of the plane right to the deck." Higgins stared at the cannon. He thought of the Japanese barges. He thought of the terrified faces of his crew as their bullets bounced off the enemy hulls. "Sterling will court-martial us if he sees us doing this," Higgins said softly. "Then we don't let him see it," Gallagher replied. "We do it at night, in the maintenance shed at the end of the cove." Higgins hesitated for only a second. "Get to work, Corporal." For the next 4 nights, PT-173 was hidden under camouflage netting at the far end of the base. The crew worked in absolute secrecy, operating under the dim glow of red-lensed flashlights to avoid drawing attention from overhead Japanese reconnaissance planes. The task was a monumental engineering nightmare. Gallagher and machinist mate Bill Davies first had to strip the entire forward deck of the boat. They removed the useless torpedo tube from the port side to save weight and make room for the massive gun assembly. The heat was suffocating. Mosquitoes swarmed the men as they worked, biting relentlessly. "Hold the plate steady, Sam," Gallagher hissed, as gunner's mate Peterson leaned his entire body weight onto a heavy sheet of scavenged steel. Sparks flew, illuminating the sweat-drenched faces of the crew, as Davies used an acetylene torch to cut the steel to match the contour of the PT boat's bow. They laid down heavy timber crossbeams, bolting them directly into the boat's ribs, and then laid the steel plate over the wood. It was an ugly, brutal fix, but it was strong. Then came the hardest part, mounting the gun itself. They couldn't just drop it on the deck. In the P-39, the gun was fired electronically via a trigger on the pilot's joystick. Gallagher had to rewire the entire firing mechanism. He ran heavy-gauge electrical wire from the 37mm solenoid down through a newly drilled hole in the deck and wired it to a crude, heavy-duty toggle switch mounted next to the boat's steering wheel. "So, let me get this straight," Higgins said on the 3rd night, staring at the wires in his cockpit. "I steer the boat, and when I want to shoot the cannon, I flip this light switch?" "Basically, yes," Gallagher said, wiping grease onto his pants. "You have to aim the whole boat, Skipper. The gun is fixed forward, just like a fighter plane." It was an insane proposition. PT boats were meant to be fast and agile, not fixed gun platforms. But desperation breeds innovation. By the 4th night, the monstrosity was complete. Sitting on the bow of the sleek wooden boat was the brutal, unpainted nose assembly of the P-39, complete with the massive 37mm cannon protruding forward like a metal spear. They had covered it with a custom-sewn canvas tarp to hide it from prying eyes on the base. They had 30 rounds of high-explosive, armor-piercing ammunition salvaged from the wreck. There was no way to get more once it was gone. "We need to test-fire it," Higgins whispered as they stood back to admire their handiwork. "If this thing rips the boat apart, I want to know. Before we're staring down a Japanese convoy." Gallagher shook his head. "We can't, Skipper. The noise will wake up the whole base. Sterling will have us in irons before morning. And we only have 30 shells. We can't waste a single one on a tree stump." Before Higgins could argue, a frantic runner burst into the maintenance shed. It was a young ensign from the radio room. "Lieutenant Higgins, we got a Coast Watcher report. A massive Daihatsu convoy is moving down the Vela Gulf. They're heavily escorted. Commander Sterling is ordering every available boat to intercept immediately." Higgins exchanged a long, hard look with Gallagher. The time for testing was gone. "Get the tarp off," Higgins ordered his crew, his voice suddenly calm, hardened by the reality of what was about to happen. "Warm up the Packards. We're taking the devil to the Strait." 10 minutes later, PT 173 rumbled out of the cove, slipping into the ink-black waters of the Pacific. As they passed the command dock, Commander Sterling was standing with his binoculars, watching the boats deploy. As PT 173 passed by, the moonlight caught the massive, ugly steel protrusion on the bow. Sterling lowered his binoculars, his jaw dropping. He grabbed a radio microphone. "PT 173, this is base. Higgins, what in the name of God is strapped to your deck?" "Over." Higgins keyed his radio, staring straight ahead into the darkness. "A little field modification." "Base. Request radio silence. We are entering the combat zone." "Out." The boat picked up speed, the bow lifting out of the water. The night air rushed past them, cooling the sweat on their faces. "Load the weapon, Tommy," Higgins yelled over the roar of the engines. Gallagher crawled forward onto the reinforced deck, moving carefully over the steel plating. The boat was bucking over the swells, making every movement treacherous. He wrestled the heavy, continuous loop ammunition belt into the receiver of the 37mm cannon. He pulled the heavy charging handle back with a loud, metallic clack-clack that sounded terrifyingly loud over the wind. "She's armed, Skipper," Gallagher yelled, crawling back to the cockpit. They navigated silently for another hour, entering the narrow, treacherous waters of the Vela Gulf. The tension on the boat was palpable. Every man knew that if Gallagher's calculations were wrong, the first time Higgins pulled that trigger, the recoil could shatter the boat's spine, sinking them instantly in shark-infested waters. Suddenly, Sam Peterson pointed dead ahead. "There. Shadows on the water. Port bow. 2 miles. Higgins squinted. Through the gloom, the low, wide silhouettes of 3 Japanese Daihatsu barges were carving through the water, heading straight for the American lines. "General quarters," Higgins said softly. "Sam, get on the 50s, but don't fire until I do. We need to get close." PT 173 crept closer, its engine mufflers engaged to mask the sound. At 1,000 yards, the Japanese barges spotted them. A spotlight flared to life from the lead barge, pinning the fragile PT boat in a blinding white beam. Immediately, the Japanese 20mm cannons opened up. Water spouted in tall, white geysers all around them as the heavy rounds hunted for the wooden hull. "Skipper, they're dialing us in," Sam screamed over the gunfire. "Steady," Higgins muttered, his hand hovering over the rigged toggle switch. He needed to be close. He needed a guaranteed hit. The boat was bouncing violently on the waves, throwing off his aim. 500 yards. 400 yards. A 20mm round tore through the starboard gunwale, showering the crew in razor-sharp wood splinters. "Now, Skipper, hit it!" Gallagher roared. Higgins aligned the bow of the boat dead center with the spotlight of the lead barge. He braced his feet against the deck, gritted his teeth, and flipped the heavy electrical switch. Nothing happened. The cannon remained silent. The boat continued to charge headlong into the teeth of the enemy fire. "It's jammed," Higgins screamed, frantically flipping the switch back and forth. "Gallagher, the gun won't fire." Gallagher's heart dropped into his stomach. They were 300 yards away, charging directly into a wall of armor-piercing fire. And their secret weapon was a dead piece of metal. The searchlight of the lead Daihatsu barge pinned PT 173 like a bug on a slide. Green tracers from the Japanese 20mm cannons whipped past the cockpit, hissing as they plunged into the boiling sea. The wooden hull shuddered violently as a round smashed through the forward starboard cleat, showering Lieutenant Higgins in fiberglass and splinters. "The gun is dead. It's a dead circuit," Higgins roared, slamming his fist against the useless toggle switch. 250 yards. The silhouette of the barge was growing massively large in their windshield. They were close enough to see the Japanese gunners, feeding ammunition into their breeches. Gallagher didn't hesitate. He scrambled out of the armored cockpit and threw himself flat onto the reinforced steel decking of the bow. The boat was bucking like a wild horse over the swells, the open ocean threatening to wash him over the side with every crest. "Tommy, get down," Sam Peterson screamed from the twin 50s, laying down a desperate, blinding stream of return fire that merely sparked and ricocheted off the Japanese armor. Gallagher low-crawled toward the massive, canvas-draped nose of the P-39. The air around him snapped and cracked with the supersonic passage of enemy rounds. He ripped the canvas back, exposing the dull gray metal of the 37mm cannon. His mind raced through the crude electrical circuit he had built just hours before. Asterisk power source. The 2.4-volt battery bank in the engine room. Asterisk switch. The heavy-duty toggle at the helm. Asterisk actuator. The aircraft solenoid mounted directly on the gun's firing sear. Asterisk ground. The engine block. The ground. Gallagher realized his fatal error. He had grounded the circuit to the steel plate, assuming the lag bolts touching the wet, salty wood of the keel would provide enough conductivity back to the engine room. But the heavy coat of marine paint and the rubberized insulation they had used to waterproof the deck had completely isolated the steel plate. The circuit was open. The gun had no electricity. 150 yards. Gallagher reached into his soaked canvas tool bag and pulled out a heavy pair of steel wire cutters. There was no time to run a new wire. He had to manually bridge the solenoid to the firing pin, bypassing the electrical system entirely. He crawled directly under the massive breech of the cannon. The smell of aviation, grease, and sea salt was overpowering. He jammed the rubber handles of the wire cutters directly into the firing mechanism, wedging them against the mechanical sear release that the solenoid was supposed to actuate. "Skipper!" Gallagher screamed at the top of his lungs, turning his head toward the cockpit. "When I drop my hand, hold her steady. I'm firing it manually." Higgins couldn't hear him over the deafening roar of the Packard engines and the relentless hammering of the machine guns. But he saw Gallagher raise his right hand. Higgins gripped the wooden wheel, muscles bulging as he fought the current to keep the bow pointed dead center at the blinding Japanese searchlight. Gallagher took a breath, closed his eyes against the blinding glare, and dropped his hand. With all his strength, he twisted the wire cutters, forcing the mechanical sear backward. Thump. The sound was unlike anything ever heard on a PT boat. It wasn't a crack or a bang. It was a concussive, chest-crushing detonation. A massive tongue of orange flame erupted from the muzzle of the P-39 nose. The recoil was instantaneous and apocalyptic. The entire 78-foot wooden boat stopped dead in the water for a fraction of a second, violently shoved backward by the massive kinetic force of the 37mm cannon. The steel decking groaned. The heavy timber crossbeams beneath Gallagher shrieked in protest, the sound of tearing wood echoing through the hull. Gallagher was thrown backward against the cockpit bulkhead, his ears ringing with a high-pitched, agonizing whine. But the shell was away. The heavy, armor-piercing, high-explosive round traveled the 100 yards in a heartbeat. It struck the lead Daihatsu barge, directly beneath its searchlight. The effect was devastating. The Japanese armor, designed to deflect 50-caliber machine gun rounds, offered zero resistance to an anti-tank shell. The 37mm round punched cleanly through the steel plating, traveled deep into the crowded troop compartment of the barge, and detonated. A blinding white flash illuminated the Vela Gulf, followed by a shockwave that rattled the teeth in Higgins's skull. The heavy steel barge seemed to lift entirely out of the water, its hull peeling open like a tin can. The searchlight died instantly. Secondary explosions ripped through the vessel as its own ammunition and fuel reserves caught fire. Within seconds, the lead barge was a burning, sinking tomb, dragging its crew into the dark depths of the Blackett Strait. The remaining 2 Japanese barges immediately ceased fire, abruptly throwing their engines into reverse. Panic ensued in their ranks. They had been told the American PT boats only carried machine guns and faulty torpedoes. They had no idea what kind of naval artillery had just obliterated their lead ship with a single, deafening shot. "They're running!" Peterson yelled, a manic, disbelieving laugh escaping his chest. "Skipper, they're turning away!" Higgins stared at the burning wreckage, his hands trembling on the wheel. He looked down at the bow. The P-39 nose was smoking, a thin wisp of gray drifting from the barrel. The heavy steel plate they had bolted to the deck was warped, its edges curled upward like a potato chip. But the hull was intact. The boat hadn't sunk. "Gallagher!" Higgins shouted, scrambling forward. The mechanic groaned, pushing himself up from the deck, rubbing the back of his head. "I'm alive, Skipper." "Gun works." Higgins let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. "Cut the engines," he ordered. "Let's assess the damage and get the hell out of here before their destroyers show up." The mood at the Rendova PT base the next morning was electric. The splinter fleet had grown accustomed to returning with wounded men, empty torpedo tubes, and tales of near misses. PT 173 limped into the cove at dawn, smelling of cordite, burnt wood, and victory. Commander Richard Sterling was waiting on the dock. As Higgins cut the engines and the boat drifted into its slip, Sterling's eyes locked onto the massive, soot-stained monstrosity bolted to the bow. "Lieutenant Higgins," Sterling said, stepping aboard the battered vessel. He walked slowly around the P-39 nose, inspecting the warped steel deck and the shattered wood where the recoil had nearly ripped the cleats off. "Commander," Higgins replied, saluting stiffly. Sterling didn't return the salute immediately. He reached out and touched the cooling barrel of the 37mm cannon. Base radio intercepted Japanese naval chatter 3 hours ago. They are reporting that the Americans have deployed a new class of mini-destroyer in the Vela Gulf. They are calling it Akuma no Fune, the Devil Boat. Higgins glanced at Gallagher, who was trying to look inconspicuous near the engine hatch. "They say," Sterling continued, a faint, incredulous smile breaking through his stern facade, "that this new boat possesses a demon cannon that can shatter a Daihatsu with a single strike. I am assuming they are talking about this. Unauthorized, highly illegal, structural nightmare, bolted to your deck." "Yes, sir," Higgins said. "We sank a heavily armored barge. One shot." Sterling pulled a small notebook from his breast pocket. "I should have you court-martialed for reckless endangerment of Navy property. That recoil could have split your keel." He paused, looking at the exhausted, triumphant faces of the crew. "But I can't argue with a sunken barge." Sterling handed Higgins a piece of paper. It was a requisition form. "I am officially classifying this as an experimental forward battery. But if you're going to use it, you need to fix this deck properly before you rip your own bow off, and you have a bigger problem." Higgins looked at the form. It was blank. "Sir?" "Ammunition," Sterling said bluntly. "The Navy doesn't stock 37mm aircraft shells. We use 40mm Bofors and 20mm Oerlikons. If you want to keep playing with your new toy, you're going to have to find the bullets yourself." Dismissed. The reality of their situation sank in. They had the ultimate weapon, but it was a starving beast. Below decks, Gallagher and Davies sat under a swinging yellow bulb, tallying the brutal toll the single shot had taken on the boat. PT 173. Post-action assessment. Component, status, required action, forward keel ribs, hairline fractures detected, reinforce with steel cross-bracing, deck plating, warped by 15 degrees, add shock-absorbing rubber gaskets, 37mm firing circuit, failed grounding issue, rewire with dedicated negative lead to battery, ammunition, remaining, 29 rounds, critical, scavenge Army Air Force supply lines, 29 shots, Gallagher muttered, tossing his pencil onto the table. "If we miss, or if we run into a swarm, we're empty." "Then we don't miss," Higgins said, stepping down into the narrow cabin. He had a map rolled up under his arm. And we go shopping. Higgins unrolled the map on the small table. He pointed to a small airstrip on the neighboring island of Munda, recently captured by American forces. The Army Air Forces just set up a forward operating base here. They fly P-39s out of Munda for ground attack missions. If there's 37mm ammo anywhere in the Solomons, it's sitting in a mud puddle over there. So we just sail over and ask nicely? Davies asked skeptically. The Army hates the Navy. We don't ask the brass, Higgins smirked. We trade. What does the Army have plenty of? Mud, Gallagher offered. Malaria. Sea rations. Exactly, Higgins said. And what do we have that they desperately want? Peterson, who had just walked in, grinned. Fresh coffee. And those canned peaches we liberated from the supply ship last week. Get the engines patched up, Higgins ordered. Tonight, we're not hunting barges. We're running a black market supply run to Munda. Bring the peaches. The birth of the Devil Boat was not just a triumph of engineering. It was a testament to the sheer, desperate ingenuity of the men fighting a forgotten war in the dark. They had turned a piece of a dead airplane into a naval legend. But to keep that legend alive, they were going to have to become pirates. The Munda Point airstrip was a fresh, bleeding wound carved into the unforgiving face of the new Georgia jungle. By day, it was a chaotic, dust-choked hornet's nest, where Army Air Forces pilots hurled their P-38 Lightnings and P-39 Airacobras into the blinding Pacific sky to intercept endless waves of Japanese bombers. But by night, the airstrip devolved into a miserable, malaria-ridden swamp. It was a place where exhausted, grease-stained mechanics worked under the dim glow of blackout lamps, trying to piece bullet-riddled aircraft back together using spit, baling wire, and a relentless stream of exhausted profanity. PT-173 slid silently into a mangrove-choked inlet, a little over a mile down the coast from the airstrip's main perimeter. The jungle canopy hung low and heavy over the water, a thick curtain of vines and broad leaves that plunged the boat into absolute, suffocating darkness. The air was entirely stagnant, smelling of rotting coral, decaying vegetation, and the sharp, metallic tang of unburned aviation fuel drifting over from the base. Lieutenant Higgins reached up and killed the thrumming Packard engines. The sudden silence was almost as deafening as the roar had been, quickly replaced by the clicks, whistles, and croaks of the deep jungle. "All right, listen up," Higgins whispered, turning to his crew. His face was painted in stripes of black grease to break up his features in the moonlight. "Operation Peach Drop is a go. Gallagher, Davies, you're with me. Sam, you and the rest of the boys stay here. Keep the engines warm but muffled. Keep the 50s manned and pointed at the channel. If a Japanese patrol boat spots you, or if a Betty bomber decides to drop a flare, you cut the lines and you leave us. Do you understand me?" Gunner's mate Peterson swallowed hard, his hands resting on the grips of his machine guns. "We aren't leaving you behind in this swamp, Skipper. If you get compromised, you leave," Higgins repeated, his voice leaving no room for argument. "We are entirely unauthorized to be here. If we lose the boat, we all end up in a stockade in Brisbane, assuming the Japanese don't shoot us first. We'll leave a green flashlight signal for pickup when we get back to the shoreline." Higgins, Gallagher, and Davies slipped over the side of the boat, dropping waist-deep into the tepid, foul-smelling swamp water. The mud at the bottom immediately sucked at their boots, threatening to pull them under. They dragged a heavy, reinforced canvas life raft behind them. It wasn't loaded with weapons or extra radio gear. It was loaded with the absolute most valuable currency in the entire South Pacific theater. 3 wooden crates of heavy, syrupy canned peaches, 10 pounds of real, unroasted Colombian coffee beans, and 2 pristine, wax-sealed bottles of Kentucky bourbon that Commander Sterling had foolishly left unguarded in his personal footlocker back at Rendova. The trek through the jungle was an agonizing, slow-motion nightmare. Every shadow looked like a Japanese sniper waiting in the canopy. Every snapped twig sounded like the prelude to a terrifying ambush. The mosquitoes were relentless, biting through their thick cotton uniforms and swarming their eyes and ears. "I swear to God," Davies muttered, slapping a massive insect on his neck. "If I die out here carrying canned fruit for the army, I'm going to haunt you forever, Artie." "Keep your voice down," Higgins hissed, pausing to check his luminous compass dial. "We're coming up on the southern perimeter wire." They bypassed the outer sentries by crawling through a deep, muddy drainage ditch that smelled strongly of latrines and diesel runoff. The contrast between the pitch-black jungle and the sprawling, chaotic encampment of the 347th Fighter Group was jarring. Harsh arc lamps illuminated the perforated steel plating of the runway, casting long, stark shadows. "Keep low behind those rusted oil drums," Higgins ordered, pointing toward a massive stack of debris near the edge of the tree line. "The ordnance tents will be heavily guarded by military police. We can't go anywhere near the official supply dumps. We need to find the mechanics' bays. They're the ones who control the floor inventory." They moved like ghosts between stacks of wooden crates and broken airplane wings. Suddenly, a flashlight beam swept across the dirt just inches from Gallagher's boots. An Army military police officer, rifle slung over his shoulder, was walking a patrol route right toward them. Higgins pressed his back against a stack of discarded tires, holding his breath. Gallagher and Davies froze, sinking deeper into the mud. The MP paused, taking a drag from a cigarette, the glowing cherry illuminating his tired face. For agonizing seconds, he stared directly at the shadows, concealing the Navy men. Then, a loud mechanical crash from a nearby maintenance tent drew his attention, and he turned, jogging away to investigate. Higgins exhaled a shaky breath. "That was too close. Let's move." They crept toward the source of the noise, a massive, open-sided canvas maintenance tent at the edge of the tarmac. Beneath the harsh glare of a single, swinging bulb, a half-dozen shirtless Army mechanics were swarming over the stripped chassis of a P-39 Airacobra. The air compressor hissed violently as they used pneumatic tools to remove a shattered wing spar. Standing dead center in the chaos, pointing a grease-stained finger and shouting orders around a thoroughly chewed-up cigar, was a man whose reputation preceded him. It was Major Paul "Pappy" Gunn. Though technically attached to the bomber squadrons operating out of Australia and New Guinea, Pappy was famous across the entire Pacific Fleet for being a completely eccentric, utterly brilliant engineering genius. He was the lunatic who had single-handedly figured out how to strap an obscene number of forward-firing 50-caliber machine guns into the glass noses of B-25 Mitchell bombers, turning slow, medium bombers into the most devastating strafing platforms in the sky. If there was anyone on this miserable, mosquito-bitten island who would understand and appreciate the sheer madness of what PT-173 had done, it was Pappy Gunn. Higgins wiped the mud from his face, stepped out of the shadows, and walked directly into the edge of the light, his hands empty and raised. An Army sentry near the tool benches instantly racked the bolt of his Thompson submachine gun, leveling the heavy weapon at Higgins's chest. "Hold it right there, squid. You're a long, long way from the ocean. Hands where I can see 'em." Pappy Gunn turned slowly, squinting through the thick, blue smoke of his cigar. He looked at Higgins's salt-stained, filthy navy khakis, then peered into the darkness at the heavy canvas sacks Gallagher and Davies were struggling to carry. "Stand down, soldier," Pappy growled to the sentry, though he didn't take his eyes off the Navy men. He walked slowly over to Higgins, wiping a thick layer of engine grease onto a rag. "Navy. Over here in the mud. You boys either took a very wrong turn at Guadalcanal, or you're looking for something you absolutely ain't supposed to have." "Major Gunn," Higgins said, snapping a sharp, respectful salute despite the informal setting. "Lieutenant Artie Higgins, Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron. I've heard a lot of stories about you, sir." "Yeah? Well, I try to keep the rumors entirely true," Pappy said, returning a lazy, two-finger salute. He eyed the heavy sacks, dripping swamp water onto his dry tarmac. Nobody sneaks into an army base in the dead of night just to say hello. What's in the bags, Lieutenant? Peaches, Major, Higgins said smoothly, signaling Gallagher to step forward. The heavy syrup kind. Real, fresh coffee beans, not that powdered dirt they serve in the mess. And some top-shelf Kentucky medicine that hasn't seen the sun in 5 years. The mechanics around the shattered P-39 stopped working immediately. The pneumatic tools fell silent. The word peaches hung in the humid, stinking air like a siren song. These men had been eating powdered eggs, stale crackers, and canned meat hash for 3 solid months. The thought of sweet fruit and real bourbon was intoxicating. Pappy's eyes narrowed into sharp slits. Nobody brings that kind of gold into my camp unless they want something that costs blood, sweat, or iron. What are you looking for, Navy? Spark plugs? High-octane fuel? 37mm high-explosive, armor-piercing shells, Higgins said flatly, his voice carrying over the quiet hum of the generator. As many as you can possibly spare. Pappy took the cigar out of his mouth, a look of genuine, profound confusion crossing his weathered face. He looked at Higgins, then at Gallagher. 37 mil? For a PT boat? You boys shoot defective torpedoes and machine guns. What in God's green earth are you doing asking for aircraft artillery? Gallagher stepped forward, pulling his shoulders back. We salvaged the entire nose assembly off a downed Airacobra on Colombangara a few days ago, Major. We unbolted the whole rig, dragged it through the mud, and bolted it directly to the forward deck of our boat. I rewired the firing solenoid to a heavy-duty toggle switch right at the helm. Pappy stared at the young, grease-stained Army corporal in a Navy uniform. The silence in the tent was absolute, thick with disbelief. Then, a slow, wide grin began to spread across the Major's face, crinkling the corners of his eyes. He started to laugh, a deep, booming, rumbling belly laugh that echoed across the quiet tarmac. You bolted an Oldsmobile M4 anti-tank cannon to a plywood dinghy? Pappy roared, slapping his knee. And the recoil didn't rip the front off the damn boat and sink you on the spot? We braced it with half-inch salvage steel plate and tied it straight into the keel ribs with lag bolts, sir, Gallagher explained, his chest puffing out with pride. We fired it manually 2 nights ago, in the Blackett Strait. Blew a Japanese Daihatsu barge clean out of the water in 1 shot. Pappy walked over to Gallagher, clapping him on the shoulder hard enough to rattle his teeth. Son, that is the most gloriously stupid, recklessly beautiful piece of field engineering I have ever heard of in my life. The Navy brass must be having absolute kittens over this. They don't know the half of it, sir. Higgins smiled, sensing he had won the man over. But we're down to exactly 29 rounds. We have a major Tokyo Express convoy coming down the slot tomorrow night. And if we're going to survive, we need teeth. Pappy turned to his mechanics, his demeanor instantly shifting back to command. Boys, take the Navy's groceries, unpack the coffee, and hide the bourbon before the MPs smell it. He looked back at Higgins, his expression sobering. I can't give you anything from our primary reserve. The pilots need every shell. But we got a massive shipment of M80 armor-piercing rounds yesterday that got left out on the dock during the monsoon rains. The supply officer condemned the entire batch because the wooden crates rotted and the brass casings are tarnished. They're slated to be dumped in the ocean tomorrow. Will they still fire? Higgins asked, his heart hammering in his chest. The primers are sealed tight with lacquer, Pappy grinned, his cigar glowing cherry red in the dark. They'll fire just fine, 400 rounds, and I'll throw in a couple of spare continuous loop magazines, just because I love the cut of your jib. You boys are going to need 'em. For the next 2 grueling hours, the Navy crew and the Army mechanics worked side by side in absolute silence, hauling hundreds of pounds of heavy brass and steel shells through the jungle swamp. Back to the waiting raft was agonizing work. Their muscles burned, their boots filled with foul water, and the threat of discovery loomed over every snapped twig. But the bitter rivalry between the branches vanished in the mud, replaced by a shared, unspoken brotherhood of desperate men doing whatever it took to survive the meat grinder of the Pacific War. As they loaded the last brutally heavy crate of condemned ammunition onto the pitching deck of PT-173, Higgins looked back toward the dark tree line. "Give 'em hell, Lieutenant." Pappy's distant voice drifted out of the humid darkness. "Let the devil roar." The Blackett Strait was a graveyard of ships, its depths littered with the shattered steel of both American and Japanese fleets. On the night of August 12th, a heavy fog rolled across the water, turning the world into a claustrophobic, gray nightmare. PT-173 idled in the shadows of a tiny coral atoll. The boat had been transformed. Gallagher had spent the last 24 hours rewiring the 37mm cannon, establishing a rock-solid electrical ground straight to the engine block. The massive steel deck plate had been hammered flat and reinforced with heavy rubber gaskets cut from airplane tires to absorb the violent shockwave. Beneath the canvas tarp, the cannon was loaded with a fresh belt of Pappy Gun's tarnished, deadly shells. Below decks, the radio hissed to life with a burst of static. "Base to all units?" Commander Sterling's voice crackled, tight with tension. "Coast Watchers confirm Tokyo Express is entering the slot. 5. Repeat. 5. Heavily armed Daihatsu barges, escorted by 2 sub-chasers. They are making a run for Vila. Intercept and destroy." Higgins keyed the mic. PT-173 acknowledging. "We have the scent." He turned to his crew. Their faces were pale in the red glow of the instrument panel, slick with sweat and fear. But their eyes were hard. They were no longer victims waiting to be chewed up by superior armor. They were the hunters. "Engines to a third," Higgins ordered. "Keep us quiet until we're in their laps." The PT boat crept out of the atoll, moving like a ghost through the fog. 10 minutes passed, then 20. The only sound was the low, throaty purr of the Packards and the slapping of water against the hull. "Skipper," Sam Peterson whispered urgently from the radar screen. "Contacts. 2 miles dead ahead. They're moving fast, right down the center of the channel." "General quarters," Higgins said softly. "Gallagher, arm the nose." Gallagher crawled forward onto the steel deck. The metal was cold beneath his hands. He ripped the canvas tarp away, exposing the brutal snout of the Airacobra cannon. He racked the heavy charging handle. Clack, clack. He flipped the safety switch and crawled back to the cockpit. "Armed and green, Skipper. You have control." At 1,000 yards, the fog suddenly parted, revealing the Japanese convoy. It was a terrifying sight. 5 massive, armored barges were slicing through the water in a tight echelon formation, bristling with 20mm cannons and heavy machine guns. Flanking them were the sleek, deadly silhouettes of 2 sub-chasers. The Japanese spotted them instantly. Star shells burst high in the sky, illuminating the strait in a harsh, swinging yellow light. "Open the throttles!" Higgins roared. "Give me everything she's got!" The 3 Packard V-12s screamed in unison, kicking the bow of PT-173 high, out of the water. The boat surged forward, throwing a massive white wake as it accelerated past 40 knots, charging head-on into the teeth of the enemy formation. The ocean erupted. Dozens of Japanese cannons opened fire simultaneously. The air was thick with glowing green tracers, crossing and intersecting like a deadly spiderweb. Water columns shot into the air, all around them, drenching the crew. "Target the lead barge!" Higgins yelled, fighting the wheel as the boat bounced violently over the chop. "Hold your fire until we're point blank. Let them see the whites of your eyes." 500 yards. 400. The armor plating of the lead Daihatsu filled Higgins's windshield. He could see the muzzle flashes of their guns blinking furiously. 300 yards. Higgins slammed his thumb onto the red toggle switch on the steering column. Thump, thump, thump. The 37mm cannon roared to life. It wasn't a single shot this time. It was a continuous, rhythmic hammering that shook PT-173 to its very keel. Huge tongues of orange flame spat from the nose, illuminating the frantic faces of the American crew. The heavy, high-explosive, armor-piercing shells crossed the distance instantly. The first shell slammed into the bow of the lead barge, punching a hole the size of a dinner plate through the steel. The second shell detonated inside the troop compartment. The third struck the barge's fuel lines. The Japanese vessel didn't just sink, it disintegrated. A massive fireball consumed the barge, sending a shockwave across the water that blew out the windshield of PT-173. Higgins threw the wheel hard to port, hauling the PT boat into a violent, skidding turn to avoid the burning wreckage. Switching targets. Number 2. Barge, dead ahead. He brought the bow around, lining up the crosshairs painted on his glass. He pressed the switch again. Thump, thump, thump. 3 more shells tore across the water. The 37mm cannon was performing flawlessly, the heavy rubber gaskets absorbing just enough of the recoil to keep the wooden boat from shaking itself apart. The second barge took a direct hit to its steering house. The Japanese captain was vaporized, and the rudder locked hard to starboard, sending the barge careening wildly out of formation and crashing heavily into one of the escorting subchasers. Panic gripped the Japanese convoy. The remaining vessels broke formation, their gunners firing wildly into the dark, completely terrified by the devastating, rapid-fire artillery, tearing them to pieces from an unseen angle. "We got 'em on the run," Peterson screamed, leaning over his twin 50s, and pouring a steady stream of tracer fire onto the decks of the scattered barges. "Don't get cocky," Higgins yelled. "Bring us around for another pass. Target the subchaser that's taking on water." Higgins spun the wheel, lining up the wounded subchaser that had been rammed. He pressed the firing toggle. Thump, click. The cannon fired once, then fell dead silent. "Jammed," Gallagher screamed, already scrambling out of the cockpit onto the slippery, blood and water-soaked steel deck. The single shot had grazed the subchaser, but it hadn't stopped it. The Japanese crew, realizing the terrible American cannon had stopped, immediately turned their heavy dual-purpose deck guns directly onto PT-173. "Get us out of here, Artie," Davies yelled from the engine hatch. "They're locking onto us." Higgins threw the throttles forward, but the subchaser was already anticipating the move. A massive 3-inch shell screamed overhead, ripping through the radar mast and showering the deck in sparks and shredded wire. Gallagher was kneeling on the bow, completely exposed to the incoming fire, desperately trying to pry the jammed brass casing out of the cannon's hot breech. The shell had ruptured, the tarnished brass from the jungle dump finally failing under the extreme heat. "I can't clear it," Gallagher roared, his hands blistering through his gloves. "The breech is locked solid." They were trapped. The subchaser was turning its broadside, preparing to unleash a salvo that would vaporize the fragile wooden PT boat. Higgins looked at the jammed cannon, then at the massive Japanese ship bearing down on them. His eyes fell on the single remaining torpedo tube mounted on the starboard deck. It held a Mark 8 torpedo, the same torpedoes that always failed, the same torpedoes they had stopped relying on. But they had no other choice. "Sam!" Higgins screamed. "Arm the fish! We're making a torpedo run!" "They don't work, Skipper. The detonators are duds." "I don't care. Arm it." Higgins threw the wheel hard over, bringing the boat into a terrifying, perpendicular run directly across the subchaser's bow. It was suicidal. They were closing to within 50 yards point-blank range for a torpedo, and impossible to miss for the Japanese gunners. The air was a solid sheet of lead. Bullets ripped through the mahogany hull, shattering the wooden ribs. "Fire!" Higgins yelled. Peterson slammed his fist onto the percussion cap. With a loud whoosh, the heavy steel torpedo slid out of the tube, dropping into the churning water. Higgins immediately threw the boat into a sharp, evasive turn, the G-force slamming the crew against the bulkheads. They held their breath, waiting for the familiar, sickeningly dull thud of a dud torpedo bouncing off a steel hull. Instead, the night ripped open. Perhaps it was the incredibly short range, or perhaps the torpedo had finally struck at the exact, perfect angle required by its flawed detonator. The 600-pound Torpex warhead detonated directly beneath the keel of the Japanese subchaser. A pillar of water and fire shot 100 feet into the air. The shock wave lifted PT-173 entirely out of the water, throwing Higgins against the wheel and knocking the breath from his lungs. When the boat crashed back down, the subchaser was gone, replaced by a boiling, flaming slick of oil and debris. The remaining Japanese barges, having witnessed the total annihilation of their lead ships and their heavy escort, turned tail and fled into the fog, abandoning their mission. Silence fell over the Blackett Strait, broken only by the crackle of burning debris and the coughing of the battered Packard engines. Higgins pulled himself up, his uniform soaked in blood from a shallow shrapnel cut on his forehead. He looked out over the burning water, then down at his crew. Gallagher was slumped against the jammed cannon, exhausted but unharmed. Peterson was laughing hysterically, staring at the empty torpedo tube. "Damage report," Higgins croaked, his voice raw. "We're taking on water forward, Skipper," Davies yelled from below. "But the pumps are holding. Engines 2 and 3 are running hot, but they're alive." Higgins looked at the ruined, smoking nose of the P-39, bolted to his shattered deck. They had done the impossible. They had brought artillery to a knife fight. "Take us home, boys," Higgins said softly, wiping the blood from his eyes. "The devil needs a drink." The saga of PT-173 and its scavenged P-39 nose was more than just a desperate gamble in the dark waters of the Pacific. It revolutionized naval warfare. Word of the Devil boat and its devastating effectiveness against armored barges quickly reached high command. The crude, unauthorized field modification proved definitively that PT boats needed heavier, forward-firing artillery. Within months, the Navy officially began retrofitting the entire splinter fleet. The dangerous, jury-rigged aircraft cannons were replaced with factory-mounted 37mm anti-tank guns and 40mm Bofors cannons, transforming the fragile wooden vessels into lethal gunboats. The ingenuity of isolated crews, mechanics, and sailors fighting in the mosquito-infested mud forced a massive tactical shift that helped turn the tide in the Solomon Islands. Their legacy is a testament to the raw, unyielding courage of men who refused to be outgunned, bolting the sky's fury onto the ocean's splintered surface.